let me shift you out of China then. Let's Iraq. You knew Iraq really well, and Afghanistan. The troop pullout of Afghanistan and the U.S. Is this the best thing?
Well, first on Iraq, since we've already withdrawn.
Go. Yes.
Just to say that President Bush, who I think ideally would have preferred to leave a small residual force there, could not get the government of Iraq to agree to some kind of residual force staying beyond 2011. And then Mr. Obama could not get the government to agree to a status of forces agreement that would give immunities to any American troops that stayed behind.
Correct.
So we ended up withdrawing from Iraq completely. I think that's the direction we're headed in Afghanistan. We're slated to withdraw all combat troops, complete the withdrawal of all combat troops by the end of 2014. But frankly, I would be surprised if any troops remain beyond that time. They're talking about the possibility of a residual force, maybe a couple of thousand troops. But, I think believe me, the mindset in the United States at the moment, and I think the administration feels very much that way too, is I think they really would like to end our involvement in these countries, our direct involvement.
Certainly that seems the mood.
And so then you ask the question, which I ask myself constantly, which is, can Afghanistan survive the withdrawal, the complete withdrawal of Allied forces?
Well, will history repeat itself? I mean, the last time this happened in 1987, it created a vacuum that was filled in by the group that became Al-Qaeda. I mean, could history repeat itself with a complete withdrawal?
Well, there's that threat because Al-Qaeda is still around. It certainly doesn't have the same. It doesn't. I don't think has the same allure, and it certainly doesn't have the same leadership as Bin Laden. But they have proven to be fairly resilient.
Correct.
At a national level in different countries. They sort of pop up in Algeria again. They popped
Yemen,
up in
Somalia.
Yeah, exactly. The Horn of Africa.
Correct.
They were in Iraq, of course.
Right.
They haven't completely left Iraq.
They're
and who knows whether they're in Syria.
Yes.
So
again, could that create a vacuum? I guess this is, for the Al-Qaeda watchers, those were the questions.
Well, you see, but we're caught, you talk about philosophy.
Yes.
We're caught in this dilemma. People say, so when are you leaving? You've been here too long. And then the minute that the other side of the coin is raised, say, well, why are you leaving so fast? Kind of questions start coming up. And you're sort of damned if you do and damned if you don't. But I think that most Americans, and certainly our political leadership feels, more than 10 years in a place like Afghanistan is perhaps like enough already.
Correct.
So I think that's the answer you'll get back from a lot of people.
Can the UN fill in that vacuum?
The UN can do some things. I think we sometimes underestimate the degree to which the UN can help. I can name a couple of examples in Africa where I thought they did a great job, like Sierra Leone, Liberia. Peacekeeping forces, especially if they can get a reasonably robust mandate, and you get a good team there, a good commander and a good representative of the Secretary General, can accomplish quite a bit. And do it at substantially less cost in blood and treasure for countries like the United States. So it's a good deal that way.
Yes.
But they cannot carry out full-fledged combat operations. They're not designed for that.
So, Mr. Ambassador, what happens, though? Again, that would still be, I think at one point an official called it a seam of lawlessness. This is a vacuum. It could become a vacuum that could be exploited by the next group.
We have made a tremendous investment in the Afghan armed forces. The Iraqi, to go back again to Iraq, the Iraqi armed forces are pretty good. They've got sectarian problems, they've got problems between Shia and Sunni, but I don't think anybody thinks today that the army of Iraq is weak. It's pretty strong. It can do a pretty good job. I think the Afghan army is probably not so bad, although it has some operational deficiencies. The difficulty Afghanistan has as compared to Iraq is it just doesn't have the natural resources
Yes.
and the wherewithal to sustain an effort without international assistance. So even if our troops were gone, they would need financial assistance for quite a while to be able to equip and train their armed forces. That's their problem. They don't have
Yes.
the world's second largest supply of oil.
Oil in Iraq. Yes, yes. So this will remain a problem that the world will have
Well,
to
it'll
deal
be a
with.
problem, I think, and if not for or maybe not only for Afghanistan, but for Pakistan as well. That whole frontier
The tribal
area. Yeah.
region. Yes, absolutely.
But I think that we've about reached the limits of American involvement, and I think at best, and at the most, you can expect the following. You could expect, hopefully, some small residual force, somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 Western forces, or NATO or whatever, ISAF forces there, who would do the training and logistics and intelligence, maybe things like that, support functions.
Yes, yes.
And then they would need continued financial assistance. And there, I do think the NATO countries are willing to give them continued assistance to support their military establishment. And so we'll have to see if that proves to be enough. Hard to say.
Yes. I hope so.
But it's not going to be quite. It can't quite be the kind of collapse that occurred after 1989 when the Soviets withdrew, because there was really nothing there then. There wasn't this whole record of an outside powers having tried to build up Afghan capabilities.
But you still have the roots. The root is still there. I guess when you look at the way Al-Qaeda, the leadership has been degraded, but the cells, the ideology remains, and it's reforming in different ways in different parts of the world. And now, actually, one of the things we're looking at is how social media is actually helping spread it. There was somebody from the Philippines who was in touch with a Yemeni group and was going to Yemen to fight for the Al-Qaeda group there. So it's a different world. I guess you're right. We'll see. Iraq. You were there during the time of the WMD, I'm looking back at that time period.
Biggest intelligence failure in recent memory. We believed that intelligence. As we were saying, Colin Powell went to the United Nations and
Correct.
Gave a whole briefing on Iraq's WMD. I was sitting right behind him as ambassador to the UN, together with George Tenet, who was the CIA director at the time. And we believed it, and it turned out to be wrong. It was a failure of tradecraft. We relied unduly on one source, who turned out to be a phony. He was called Curveball. That was his code name. And he was actually, what he did was telling us what he wanted us to believe, because he wanted us to intervene in Iraq. He was an Iraqi source who wanted us to believe, to go in to the country. So it was a huge failure. It's the failure on which the reform then of the intelligence community was based. If it hadn't been for that episode, that incident, we would not have created the Directorate of National Intelligence, which I was then called back from Iraq to direct.
And how would you gauge the way the United States has changed intelligence in the last decade? It's 11 years since 9/11 now.
Well, we went through phases.
Yeah.
First of all, we had the phase of reacting in self-defense in Afghanistan. Then we stretched it and went into Iraq, and as we agreed, I think we overreached there. Both, we didn't really have a justification, a pretext. And secondly, we ended up starting to run up substantial costs, and these were being not paid through higher taxes or anything like that. They were just being added to the national debt. So it was a very costly situation for us. But I think where we've come out is we do have a somewhat reformed intelligence system. The integration of our intelligence effort, the information sharing, all those kinds of things, I think are substantially improved than the situation that prevailed at the time of 9/11. So that's good. But we have racked up tremendous costs, and I think what you're going to see is that we're going to spend quite a bit of time recovering from that.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to see large American expeditions
Yes.
going abroad. We're not going to be sending 60, 80, 100,000 troops around the world.
It's interesting what happened in Algeria. The French went into Mali, and then the Algeria happened without the U.S.
Right, and what we might do, as we did in Libya, and what we might ultimately do in places like Algeria, we'll play some supporting role, I'm sure. Intelligence sharing, for sure. Here's an area where we can really help friendly countries. It's transport. When the French need to move troops to Mali, they're going to come to us, as they did in this case, and say, look, we just don't have the air transport capability that you do. Can you help us get a couple of Italians down there real fast? And we can do that on relatively short notice, which might, for them, take weeks to do.
So the U.S. pulls back a little bit as the global cop of the world. The U.S. itself, I mean,
but retains a sense of interest and responsibility and engagement, but tries to alter the mix
of direct action
of the international action, so that we're not always the first one there, we're the first one to do things, and all of that.
Right.
And that maybe we can make it a bit more of a balanced approach, but not not some kind of a abandonment, or not some kind of an ostrich act. This is not putting our head in the sand. This is saying, let's go do this together. And maybe you help us in some situations, we help you. But let's look at this as a common problem and see if we can identify who can make what contribution.
President Obama took his oath again, second term. How would you describe the United States today? I mean, you've been there more than 40 years. What is it like today after going through the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, and now recovering? What is it like?
Well, first of all, I've been there all my life, so that makes it, I've been there over 70 years. But I had 44 years in
the State Department.
In government.
Yeah.
Here's the way it looks to me. I think we went through a very tough decade. But a decade is not a lifetime. It's not all of our history. And that the fundamentals in the United States are still pretty good. We have a healthy political system. The economy is starting to recover. We have a healthy demographic. This is a country of more than 300 million people, and the population is, unlike Europe and unlike some of the other Western economies and the OECD economies, we still have a relatively young demographic.
Or Japan in Asia.
Or Japan. We have a relatively young demographic because of the large quotient of immigration that we've got. So I think this is still a dynamic society. We've got both an education and an entrepreneurial system that encourages innovation. So I think we've got some work to do to recover from the difficulties of the last decade. And we certainly have to come up with a plan to bring our national debt and our fiscal crisis down to manageable proportions, which I understand it means getting your deficit down to about 3% of GDP. But I think that can be done. And so I think maybe if it took us a decade to dig ourselves this hole, I think maybe if you give us a decade to get out of it, and then I think we're going to be okay. But that'd be my kind of shorthand view of what's going to happen.